Hi, Aidy Burrows here. Recently I put out a video tutorial about procedurally texturing clean asphalt. And before I go on, I just wanted to mention you don't necessarily have to have seen that video for this tutorial to make sense though. This should be able to stand on its own. Basically, the asphalt idea was a challenge to keep everything as real time as possible and do it in Blender 2.8's real-time Eevee engine. But from that, I got asked a bunch of times how to take the results of that tutorial and simplify it onto a single plane. That way it'd be possible to get it into something external, like Unreal Engine 4 for example. But even if staying within Blender, this also means massive amounts of procedural calculations no longer need to be calculated, making everything a whole lot simpler and faster. So we'll be covering baking to a plane, but we'll see that has its limits, seeing through transparency. So instead we'll be setting up a little more like we might with, say, Substance Designer, having nodes specifically for certain passes. One of the more useful tricks to know is how to convert the bump node output into a normal map output instead. It's possible that you might not have heard about Substance Designer, so I just wanted to offer a bit more context there. Substance Designer, as they say themselves, have become the standard for creating PBR materials. You can do some pretty incredible procedural texturing with it, with all the advantages that come with that, infinite varieties and so on. You work mostly nodally within Substance Designer, and those nodes are connected to output passes that upon rendering give you all the textures required to drive your material. It can do tiling textures and depth map creation, which are both things I want to go into more detail with for Blender, by the way, in a future video. It can do some very notable things Blender really struggles with, blur and flood fill probably being key examples. What's great to see though is that several projects are underway to improve procedural texturing within Blender. It's great to see Substance Designer as such a high example to kind of try and strive for and reach towards. And it is very tempting to spend some time creating an add-on that makes working in this way a lot more effortless. Basically, Blender's got a lot of potential for this sort of stuff. Something else Substance Designer does amazingly well though is just with the sheer amount of excellent procedural organic grunge textures that can be used and are very artistically appealing and usable. Something else that I feel like Blender could probably reach towards. For Blender, Simon Thomas has some good examples for texturing procedurally that I highly recommend checking out. And talking of grunge and noises, he also has some free stuff that includes some more advanced noise patterns that are very cool. A lot of the more advanced stuff though does require a lot of nodes behind the scenes, and for me one of the main downsides when trying to use Eevee anyway for some real-time results is that we quickly max out the amount of nodes that we can use, and so that's where I want to start us off in this video. So as a quick recap, we get the pink texture of death if we use too many procedural textures that we want to work in real time. So a solution would be to use the Cycles rendering engine instead of the LookDev rendering mode we have here. But that doesn't work for us if we want to keep things real time. In which case a second option is to extend the texture by layering further details onto a new plane with a new material that hovers ever so slightly on top. So we just need a mask to use on the top plane to say where we want to show the top material or the bottom material. Now, if you've absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, you can check out this tutorial that digs into it in a lot more detail. So coming back to this example, if I simplify the amount of nodes being calculated here by redirecting the flow by holding Control and left click and try to find that point there and just plug it into here instead, and then let go, we can see our material springs back to life. So I've got those other layers in this particular example all hidden at the moment. And by the way, we can use this filter icon to show what options we want to see on this far right hand side. Currently I just want to see visibility and renderability. All these objects will render, but in this viewport they're not on display at the moment. We've got a bunch of paint stripes and an upper layer. So I'm just going to left click and drag across all these so that we can see them in our viewport. Let's select that, and if I press G to move it, then you can start to see the parts of the material that this hovering plane is responsible for. I'll right click to reset that though, and I can also select this additional object and press G here, move the mouse around, and you can see that hovering slightly above everything else. So a downside to that is going to be if we bake down to just one texture, then we're going to lose our kind of infinite resolution. We're just going to have the resolution of the image that we bake to. And the second problem will be that we'll lose the ability to tweak the texture efficiently. We'll have to return back to this setup, make the tweak, rebake, and then continue from there. but there are obvious pros to this. So it's going to then calculate new changes a lot faster. You'll notice the more nodes that you add, the longer you have to wait until you see the results of that node. Let's take a look at the simple plane baking process, because something very cool about Blender is how easy it is to do in normal circumstances to bake to a plane. But we're going to see a little problem with baking this particular setup, but we'll come to that in a second. So all we would need to do is go Shift A, mesh plane, and then I'm going to press G and then Z and just raise that above everything. Next, we need to create the texture to bake to. So I'm actually going to click new on here, and let's call this our baking material, and let's zoom in a little bit. Actually don't really need this stuff though, I just need an image texture. So Shift A, texture, image texture, drop that in there, and then I can create a new image from here. Let's make this 2048 by 2048, and I'll call this Bake Me, no need for alpha. And let's bake the base color, so we don't need any crazy bit depth here. So I'm going to leave that off and click OK. Let's create a new window so we can see the 2D image that this is going to bake. So I'm going to select this lower shader editor, and we can choose any of the corners of this. I'm just going to click from the bottom left, just because we can. So once the cursor turns into a little cross, I'm just going to left click and drag to the right, and then this shader editor, I'm going to switch to one of our 2D editors. So the image editor is fine. Let's find our Bake Me, zoom out a little bit. So we need to have this selected so it knows what we want to bake to. Then we need to come down to our bake section and say what we want to bake. And we're going to try baking the diffuse, and we don't need the direct and indirect. I just want the color. We have selected to active enabled, which means I'm going to press Z to toggle into wireframe so I can easily left click and drag across all the geometry there with our materials on. And that leaves our top plane that we want to bake to still the active object, hence selected to active, and then just hit the bake button. After the bake is complete, it gives us this image. Now something else to bear in mind for that is that it's going to take the amount of samples into account. So if we just take a look in sampling here, you can see I just got one. Certain passes are going to need more samples to get a clean bake, but in this case we should just find that one does the trick. Now let's just take a look at this, control space to maximize that window, zoom right in, and you can see that we have a large black area right here, and we can see there's large black patches here. So basically what is happening is that this bake isn't taking into consideration the transparency, and currently there's no way to factor in our alpha in the bake panel, so we'll just need to find another way to go about this. One workaround could be that we just bake each little hovering plane separately and also bake out the alpha masks. That would work in some cases, and then mix between those with a mix shader on just the one plane in the end. But I think a more attractive option in this case anyway is, instead of baking, is just simply render and treat Blender a little more like you might a program like Substance Designer. All we need to do is set up the camera. So first of all, I'm going to take this bake plane, I'm going to delete it with X. Let's press Z to go back into our look dev mode, and in this scene here I have a collection called camera. You can easily create collections just by pressing C, for example, with the cursor in the outliner, and then drag our camera or whatever we want into that collection. Well, I'm just going to undo that with Control Z and leave it in this original camera collection. So I have this bake camera which is already set up, but I'm going to press X and delete that and set it up again. I'm going to select that camera collection so that when we go Shift A and add in a camera, it adds it into this collection. And then let's press N to open up our properties sidebar. You can see it has some rotation values, which I'm going to left click and drag across and press 0, or the shortcut key to do that would be Alt R. And if we press G to move that off, we can similarly use Alt G to put it to the center of the world. Well, actually I'm going to raise this above. I'm going to press G and then Z to about there, and then let's come over to the scene tab and the dimensions here. I've set this to a square resolution like 2048, and if we press 0 to jump into this camera, you can see that we can't see the full extent of what we've done here with this material. So all we need to do is come over to the camera settings, change that from perspective to orthographic, and instead of it being 6 units that we can see, or 6 meters, we're going to set this to 2, which if I select one of these planes here, you can see the dimensions here is 2 meters by 2 meters. Finally, we just need to set up the materials of the planes of this geometry that has all of our procedural nodes on. So if we take the bottom layer for starters, this lower layer, and zoom out here to take a look at it, what we want are what we have as main inputs here. So for example, the base color, the roughness, and whatever is informing our normal. And so where those enter our principled shader, we'll channel those instead to a very simple emission shader setup. So as you can see here, the base color splits into a simple emission shader, and I've just called that base color by typing that in here. So N for the properties sidebar. Similarly for the roughness, and here I've also got height. So this node here ends up informing the height of the displacement, the bump, and also goes straight into this height emission shader. Finally down here we also have this normal map, but I'll come back to that and explain that in a moment. So assuming you've already seen the asphalt texturing tutorial, you'll likely already know this, but I thought let's just spend a few seconds to show how to use these rerouting nodes and label them, as it's actually really easy. So we can go Shift A, and we'll find under our layout section, we've got these frames here that we can just drop into position. And then if we wanted to, we could drop any nodes on top. And now we can move the frame around. Press N to open up the properties sidebar. And we have various options to change here. And we can actually call it something useful by typing in the label area. And that comes up here. We can also give it a separate color, something like this. Or we can delete that with X. Actually just select a node and then go Shift P. Thanks to the Node Wrangler add-on, it'll do that automatically for us. But again, let's delete that with X, because I just want to show about these rerouting nodes as well. So I can go Shift A and add in a reroute node here, and we just get this little circle that I can move around with G. And if I drop that on the line there, you can see this little noodle line's being redirected. But there's a quicker way to do that again, which is just holding Shift and then right-clicking across it to draw a line. And that will automatically create a new rerouting point for us. One last thing to bear in mind here, if I press T to open up the tools, you can see I'm actually set to this select tool. But we can also select these links cut tool. And that way, if we left-click and drag across here, it'll break that connection. But rather than switching tools, I just like to keep the select tool on. And I'll break the link between these two in a different way this time, just simply by adding yet another node in there and pressing X just to quickly delete it. So let's just do that again. I'll just go Shift and right click across it, and then as soon as it lands, just hit X. And that way I don't need to switch the tools. So just press T to close that. To give these little rerouting nodes a label, simply select it. Just come over to the label setting in the properties sidebar. Just make sure we're on the item tab, and then we can type anything we want into there. And it should show up here in the graph. All right, let's get back into it. So let's say we wanted to start with the base color. To make things easier, let's make sure we have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Make sure we go F4 and then Preferences. Come to our add-ons, find the node related add-ons here, and make sure this is enabled. Then I can click this. Then when we Control Shift and click on this base color here, it's automatically going to change the material output to that shader for us. And we can see in the viewport a bit of a change now. And then what I'm going to do is go to the upper layer, or I could just Alt and left click in the viewport and go upper layer.new there. And then similarly, I've set this up again here, but there's a slight increase in complexity here because it's a top layer. It has some alpha transparency to worry about. So that's why each section looks more like this. So what I need to do is Control Shift click on this mix shader here, and now we're getting the results of what our base color should be. So whatever's informing this base color in the principled shader is instead being plugged into our emission shader here, and then whatever was informing our alpha, the main transparency, so what was being plugged into this area here, is now also being plugged into the mix shader factor between a transparent shader and this emission shader. I can also do that here with our paint stripe white. So I've already set this up. So if we just come over to where we find our base color, again, we have this same setup. So I'm going to Control Shift click on this one, and then let's come over to the paint stripe yellow and then find our base color again here, Control Shift click on it. And then if we zoom out now and go Control Space in this viewport, we'll see that is the image that we want for our base color. This is essentially our base color bake. So what we can do now is simply render. Before we do render though, just a couple of things to bear in mind. So I'm going to go Control Space so we can get access to our properties over here, the main properties window. And let's come over to the rendering tab and find our color management, which is here. What we want to make sure is that we're on standard here and not filmic. If we're on filmic, we're going to get a lot of cool benefits for our final render, expanding the amount of dynamic range that can be captured and displayed to us on the viewport. But for this particular setup, we're going to need to make sure that is set to standard. And that way what we get is going to be more predictable here. Something else to bear in mind is that with the emission shader, we're again only really going to need one sample. And it may have occurred to you that this actually should work for Eevee. So in a sense, we could bake in Eevee in a way, or at least, render what we need in Eevee. However, at the moment, I would advise against doing that just because there seems to be a slight issue just at the border of the render. So to demonstrate this slight border problem that we're getting with the renders coming out of Eevee, I've taken the roughness pass of all the geometry that's making up this, since I think it's a little bit more noticeable on this example. I've switched the render display mode over to the image editor, so when we press F12 to render, it'll pop up in here instead of a separate floating window. And as you can see, we're set to cycles. If I go Control Space on this, just so that we can see that we're in slot 1, and if I hit F12, it'll re-render for us. And if I zoom right in on the edge here, we can see no particular darkening right at the border. So Control Space again, and what I'll do now is switch over to Eevee, and I'll press number 2 in this image editor to switch the slot there. So I'll press F12, and let's go full screen with this one, Control Space, and I'll zoom in even further to make it as obvious as I can. So you can see a slight darkening at the border on that, and if I press number 1 to switch to our cycles, you can see we don't get that. So by contrast, I think this is a little bit more noticeable, toggling between 1 and 2 there. Another option that we've got available to us, if I press 3 to move over to slot 3 and Control Space, is we can do a viewport render. So for that, I've turned off everything in the view using these 2 icons. So it's nice and clean, and we can go View, Viewport Render Image. And now we have that render in our image editor over here. So Control Space to maximize. So we have slot 3 for the viewport render, slot 2, which looks almost identical, if not identical there actually, and then slot 1 is our error-free at the borders cycle render. So with that explanation out of the way for why we're using cycles, I'm gonna jump back to where we were in cycles before demonstrating that Eevee border problem so that we can continue rendering our base color pass. So all we need to do is press F12, let it render. If we shrink this window and zoom out here, we have this image ready to save. Now something that I'd recommend doing is, at the moment I'm in slot 6, and what I do is just use a different slot for each pass. So for slot 6, let's say we're using that for base color. So let's jump over to slot 7, and then I'm going to close that. If we want to get that back, by the way, we can just hit F11, and then if I just bring this back into view, we can switch that back to slot 6, and there's our render again. Let's move that back to slot 7 though. And now let's set up another pass, for example the roughness pass. So I would just Control Shift click this for the yellow stripes at the sides. In the middle here, I want this roughness area here for the upper layer that we have selected there. I'm going to just zoom out and find the roughness that has been set up here. And then finally Alt left clicking to get the lower layer, and then this is a simple setup, just a single emission shader, and now this is going to be our roughness pass. So F12 to render this, and there we go. And if we press 6, we can still toggle back to our base color. Now there's our roughness pass on slot 7. To render out our height map, that's easy enough. We just Control Shift click on another of these shaders and go through the other planes. But instead of doing that, let's assume we want to take this out into something like Unreal Engine or Unity. So in that case, it would be pretty handy if we could just get a normal map straight out of here rather than just a height map. And we could do that by taking a look at what we get coming out of our bump map node. So I'm working on the lower layer right now. So I'm just going to turn off the visibility of all the other layers. So let's turn off the upper layer and just switch that lower layer back on. Zoom in a little bit. You can see the type of blue that we have on here is not the kind of blue typical in a normal map. So I'm going to switch over to this solid shading view and click on here, and you can see the matte cap is showing us a typically gamma corrected normal map representation there, and so we get this kind of purplish hue. And if we switch back to the look dev, you can see that's definitely not the kind of hue that we're getting throughout here. However, we can convert that bump map using these nodes here to get the kind of colors that we need for a normal map. So if we Control Shift click on this emission shader here, there we go. So what's happening here is I'm just taking a couple of color mix RGB nodes, and the first one is set to add with the factor slider all the way up. So we're adding a value of 1 to every channel, and then we're going to multiply by 0.5. So if we click on here, you can see 0.5 on each channel, or we could just divide by 2. At that point, we get something resembling a normal map. And if I mute this with the M key, the gamma node, then you'll see we get kind of a slightly lighter normal map, kind of represented in a linear color space. But I like seeing it in the viewport in the standard RGB color profile. That's how most normal maps that you come across will look anyway. So we can set the gamma to 2.2, and then at that point we have something that we can render. So I'm going to turn the rest of the layers on, left clicking and dragging across. I'm going to take the upper layer and find our normal map section. So adding 1 and then divided by 2, or multiplying by 0.5 rather, gamma correcting it, and then Control Shift clicking here. And now we've got both layers. Let's take the paint stripes, scroll out, and exactly the same setup here. Control Shift clicking the mix shader, and same again here. I've placed this stuff up here. Control Shift click, and there we go. We're ready to just render that normal map. So F11, here's our roughness. I'm going to press 8 to move to slot 8, close that down, and press F12. The only other piece of the puzzle is to save the renders out and see those set up in a new material, whether that be in Eevee, Cycles, or maybe another external program like Unreal Engine, Unity, Godot, and so on. First, what I'll do here is go Control Space, minimize that view, and in this 2D window here, I'll basically just find our render result. And now within this window, we can hit 6, 7, and 8 to switch between our renders. Now all we need to do to save this is to go to Image and then Save a Copy. I like to do Save a Copy rather than Save As, just so that this rendered version is unchanged. Sometimes instead of the render result, Blender will switch it for the version that we've just saved to. So instead of that, I'm going to Save a Copy. Then I'm just going to find somewhere to save it to. We're going to give it a name. So let's just call this tutorial base color, and the format is PNG and 8-bit, which is completely fine for the base color. And to save a little bit of file size, since we're not using an alpha channel, we can switch this just to RGB, and then I can hit save as image. Next, I'm going to press 7 within this view and switch to the roughness. Again, go image and then save a copy. I'm going to call this roughness. And I've found that actually saving this out as 8-bit here is okay as well. But if you are getting any weird results, I would be tempted to switch this over to 16-bit. But I'm just going to leave it as is and switch it to RGB. And then we can click save as image. And then I'm going to press 8 to switch over to the normal. And for this particular material, since it's quite rough and pretty detailed, it's not what I would say like a clean, pristine mirror-like surface. So I think for this, we can go image and save a copy and save this out as tutorial normal map and just keep this as 8-bit as well. And we're not using an alpha channel, of course, and then we can save again. When working with the height and saving this out, you may find that we need to save as 16-bit or perhaps even as an open EXR, and for that we can try a PXR24, but I'm not going to do that in this case. For more details on that, we did this article over on Creative Shrimp called the 5 Must Know Tips with Bump and Normal Maps, and if we just check that out, we'll see some more details about baking, some of the problems with the different color spaces and the file types, and just generally a couple of things to watch out for there. Alright, so I've opened up into a fresh version of Blender. Just going to resize the window slightly. Delete this cube with X, go Shift A to add in a mesh plane. I'm going to jump over to the shading workspace instead of this general layout workspace. And I'll collapse this window by just reaching to the top right of it, left clicking, dragging towards the 3D view, and then back into the file browser there, and then letting go. Over here, I'll find the material that was already by default given to us. And then off screen, I've actually got a little file browser with the images that we just saved. So I can select one of these, drag it in, first the base color, then the normal map, and then the roughness, and then we don't need that anymore. And then to quickly set this up, the roughness is simply going to be plugged into the roughness. The base color will be plugged into the base color. Let's take a look from the top orthographic now. So 7 on the numpad, and just zoom in. And then also for our normal map, what we need for this is to just input this into a vector normal map node. So the color to the color, and then the vector out into this normal vector in. Now, if we take a look around the viewport, should be able to see everything more or less working. However, you may be able to see an unusual amount of darkness, and this is due to the incorrect color space that we're using. And so I'm going to switch this to non-color, and that corrects that for us. Instead of using this environment, which is a good overall lighting, I'm just going to switch from this one by clicking on this little down arrow, clicking on the sphere, and I'm going to choose one where it's got quite a strong low sun, just to make the bump sort of work a little bit harder. Now technically the roughness map is non-color data as well, but if we switch that, since we didn't gamma correct it as we did with the normal map, it doesn't quite work correctly in Blender's viewport there, so we can just leave that happily as sRGB. It might be easier to just see this all in the same version of Blender, so I'm actually just going to go Control-C, and we've copied one selected object. Then I'll switch over to the main Blender file where we still have all of the procedural nodes. I'm going to go Control V, and I've pasted one object in under our camera collection. So I'm just going to select it, press M, and let's move that to the road collection. And move back up again. This is our simple plane. And then I'll just press G and then Y, move the mouse to about here, left click to drop that into position. And we can see that they look very, very similar now. Only of course, this material that we're using, the simple material, is just that. And this is a whole collection of planes with loads of nodes doing fancy computational stuff. And just to finish off, why not just show that same material in something else external, like Unreal Engine 4 in this case. So with this, I'm just going to create a plane by filtering over here, and then we can left click and drag this in. We'll lift that up and F to zoom in there. And then in this section, as we did in Blender, I'm just going to drag the file browser from off screen onto screen here and just drag these in. We can group these all together and do it in one go in this case though. And then we have our textures. Using our base color, I'm just going to right click this and create material. And we'll just go with the default name it's given us. Double click on there, and with this little material window that we have here, I'm just going to click and drag this normal map into it and the roughness map into it. At that point, I can dock this by clicking on the tab and just putting it next to this other tab. And then from there, we can just take the white out pin here and put it into the roughness. And for our normal map, you can see it's automatically being converted here. The main difference between normal maps in Blender and normal maps in Unreal Engine 4 though, is that in Unreal Engine 4 we're going to need to flip the green channel. Now thankfully, Unreal Engine does make that really easy. So if I just come back over to the normal map itself in the content browser, double click on it, you'll notice in the details here on the right hand side that sRGB isn't enabled, which is correct. It's non-color data. And we have this setting down here, flip green channel, which we just need to enable. You'll notice that flips in the view. Then we can just save that and exit that tab now, and then continue setting this up. So I'm just going to take this color out and plug it into the normal, and then click on the apply, come back over to the main tab here, and then we'll take our material as it gets updated there and left click and drag that onto our plane. And then now we can just orbit around the view, and we should see all the maps taking effect there. Just make sure our snapping is enabled, and then I'm going to alt left click onto this y-axis there and just pull out a copy, just so that it's a little bit of a longer road. It's not necessarily designed to tile this texture at the moment, but you can see it doesn't do too bad a job of that. And there we go. Alright, so again, we have come to the end of the road. Let's carry this on into the comments below if you want to go into any further detail on anything. And if necessary, to help clarify anything, we can add extra imagery on the main page for this tutorial over on Creative Shrimp, or follow it on with another video. Alright everybody, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.